Hello again, everyone. I hope you had a chance to get some refreshments. Again, please don't forget to tweet using the hashtag CSI 2018 Summit. So our next panel is on trade messaging, moderated by Bloomberg trade reporter Jenny Leonard. Jenny, over to you.
Yeah, hello everyone. I think while everyone in this room is really excited and knowledgeable about trade and services trade, I think it's not news to anyone that the benefits of services trade are harder to quantify and to message than the benefit of lowering tariffs. So this administration, as we know, is obviously very focused on goods trade, and we have a fabulous panel here who's going to focus on the other side, where we actually have a trade surplus. And with that, I think you have the bios, but I'm going to just introduce them really quick. It's going to be Kevin Madden, who's a partner at Hamilton Place Strategies, former press secretary for Romney Ryan, Nadim Al-Shami, policy director at Brownstein Hyatt Farber & Schreck, and former chief of staff to Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi, and Patricia Buckley, Director of Economic Policy and Analysis at Deloitte. And Patricia is going to start us off with a report that just came out.
Great, thanks, Jenny. I know the theme of the conference is rules-based trade, but I thought I'd start a little bit with some fact-based trade and services. Just as background for how messaging occurs, starting from a place of what is actually going on, I think really helps. And the world has transformed so much in recent years in regards to trade's proportion of output, of employment, and of output, employment, and trade. So when you think about output, 74% of global output is now trade. In the US, it's 79%. Even in countries like China, India, Indonesia, it's closing in on 60%. Now, to be clear, and this is a misconception that happens a lot in the US, we're not talking that we're making less manufactured goods than we have in the past. Even in the US, it's taken us a long time to dig out of the hole that manufacturing got itself into post the financial crisis. But on a real basis, output in manufacturing surpassed its prior peak that occurred before the crisis, the first quarter of this year. So we've had 2 quarters where manufacturing output, even in the US, is greater than it's ever been before. So even though services is now a much larger proportion of total global output in all areas, including manufacturing and ag, has gone up. Employment is a slightly different story, because employment, particularly like in the OECD countries, 70% of employment is accounted for by services. In the US, it's 86%. This is an area where the US actually employs fewer people today than we have in the past. So you see output rising, but employment rising faster. We've got large productivity, even though it's been a little slow lately, in manufacturing, driving up employment. Now, even with output and employment rising so much, it stands to rise faster in the future. You've got the ASEAN nations, you've got APEC, all having an emphasis on improving their services competitiveness. So this then can pivot easily into what's going on with trade in services. In total, manufacturing is still the largest part of global trade. So globally, you have 1/3 of global exports, or 1/4, pardon me, of global exports services. In the US, it's 25%. This has grown rapidly. So if you look at manufacturing exports over a 10-year period, they grew a total of 38%. Exports of services grew by 65%. And very importantly, from the US perspective, is we've got a large surplus in services that helps offset our deficit in goods. So as we look forward, it'll be interesting as other countries start raising the percentage of both output and exports they do of services, how the U.S. will fare vis-a-vis those countries. And with that, I forgot who I was going to turn over to.
I'll take it. I'll take it from you.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here, and thank you for everybody in the crowd. And thanks also for mentioning Romney Ryan 2012. I'll let you know when I'm over that one day. But you know, in sort of reference to my heritage as a political operative, one of the pieces of advice I used to give then, and I think it relates to trade messaging, is to never take apart, when I was working with candidates, never take apart the best tank of the last war in order to fight the next one. But I think the retrospective on the last successful trade win, I think is an informative one for the current time period that we're in now. So I look back and I assess the landscape going forward based on the last successful win that we had on trade, which was the TPA fight, which started in late 2014, and eventually we saw a win in Congress in 2015. And during that campaign, everybody involved on the pro-trade side deployed, I think, a very disciplined but very simplified message to audiences in order to get them engaged. And the sequence went like this. It was first, make the case for higher standards. There is a very high awareness or anxiety by those who follow the issue of trade and start to vote through the lens of trade that there are cheaters around the globe and we've let them get away for with too much for too long. The second message is personalization and localization. When you talk about trade as an economic theory, eyes glaze over. The American people, by and large, the American public, collectively, does not have an economics degree. But when you talk to them about the value and provide the living proof of trade and its impact in their community and the industries that are at the foundation of the local or regional economy, and you do it through that lens, and you personalize and localize their interest in it, you have a much better chance of persuading those voters. And then lastly is American economic preeminence. That stronger trade policy will have an impact on on America's role in a global economy that many voters are very anxious about. And when you talk to them about how this will be an important part of economic leadership and how that affects their bottom line, whether it's their family or directly their job, you have better success. Now, in 2000, during the TPA debate, that was where we first saw the cracks in the traditional GOP Republican free market coalition that had for a long time supported, or you found strong support for trade policy. And I think the cracks were, a lot of it had to do with partisanship. There was 100 members of Congress up on Capitol Hill that did not want to vote for anything they knew President Obama would sign. But a lot of it was this anxiety about globalism and how it impacted economies in key regions around the country. So there was a lot of stubborn support for TPA at the end of the vote in 2015. The second part of it was there was a huge canyon between the President Obama, and his zeal for free trade agreements, and members of Congress. And also, I think there's a canyon between some voters, some emerging key constituencies in the Democratic coalition, namely young voters who are more about trade liberalism, but that they have policymakers up on Capitol Hill that don't necessarily feel the same way or vote the same way, right? We had 28 House Democrats vote for Trade Promotion Authority, and we had 13 Democratic senators vote for it. So that is not exactly, if we're looking at how you build a coalition in a potential future Democratic majority, not exactly a recipe for great success on the issue of trade. I'll make one last point, which is what the business community did, and I think what the business community's activity during the TPA fight and why it was successful. For 6 to 8 months, there was a broad and sustained, dedicated effort by members of the business community to make the case for TPA. Every day, with volume, with intensity. And right when we declared victory, everybody ran through the tape, and they did not apply that same volume and intensity right as TPP debate was starting. And that was why we didn't see the same success replicated with TPP. TPP faced a very narrow window of opportunity, I guess in late 2016. And one of the things that folks did was they said they wanted to keep their powder dry. There was a lot of different, everybody in here probably knows there were a lot of different opinions on whether TPP was good or better, or how much emphasis, or how much, how animated they were going to be in their support for it. But in that critical window, the winning campaign of broad, sustained volume and intensity disappeared, and it didn't show up for TPP at a critical time, and that was where I think it led to what I would call the sort of trade crack up of 2016, where the volume of anti-trade rhetoric out there in billions of dollars in earned media, paid media, went unanswered for an entire year. And when you're not on the field, you can't score points. You cede the field to the opponents, they're going to win, and they ran up the score in 2016.
Thank you so much for having me. And Kevin certainly went through the TPP debate that I lived from the inside. I'm happy to go through that as well. But I really want to address a couple of issues here, and that's how, to message trade going forward, because I think it's critical. I think trade does have its benefits, but I think members of Congress especially have to understand what is at stake here. So you need to understand your audience. I think that's my first advice. The reason the agriculture community was successful in its campaign is because they knew who the audience was. It was an audience of one. It was the president. And they were successful in getting the members of Congress to continue to push for some relief, which they got. And I think number two is we have to learn from the past, and especially TPP. For a year and a half, you had a Democratic president. Think about this for a second. You had a Democratic president pushing a multilateral trade agreement to go through a Republican-controlled Congress, while at the same time dealing with his party that was beginning to have some major concerns, while at the same time dealing with the right, President Trump, who was opposed to any kind of trade agreements. So it was a tough, tough time to try to explain what is the benefit of this multilateral agreement. There were opportunities to improve it, and I believe we did improve it. We've held, briefings and meetings with the administration, and there was a path to it. However, after the TPA vote, and after 28 Democrats voted for it, not all Democrats said, no, they're not going to support it. What they said is, well, now let's just see how we can make it better. TPA was a fight that's behind us. Let's just see how we can make TPP better. And that did not last for long because the political circumstances took over. So you have to learn from your mistakes. So I agree with Kevin that you have to maintain a strong message, a disciplined, strong message going forward. And then third is, free trade versus fair trade. As a Democrat, then when you hear free trade, you hear no worker protections, no environmental protections, no wage protections. When you're a Republican and you hear fair trade, you hear impact on businesses, loss of jobs, closed opportunities. So you have to come up with something different. And I believe that's new trade. And when we begin to talk about trade and the benefits of trade, you have to talk about what value proposition you're offering these members of Congress and these senators. What does it mean to their constituents? How can you explain to them that your industry is so critical to creating jobs, to the human capital, to growing the American dream? And that's what is at stake. So I think you learn from the past and you change the messaging going forward. Free trade and fair trade is old. You have to look at new trade.
So since we just had two people talk about the TPP fight inside and out, let's talk about what are the lessons that the business community can take forward and members of Congress to message and get over the finish line to the new NAFTA deal. You just said, you have to message what's at stake here. It's a little bit different in this situation because there is no new deal passed yet, and the other agreement that is in place is one that President Trump could still withdraw from. So there's maybe a little bit more at stake. So what are the concrete things that need to be, with maybe in mind new trade, not fair trade or free trade, what are the concrete things the business community and members of Congress and everyone who wants to get this over the finish line can take from that fight?
Well, I'll take that first. I think first is where I'd be a little bit more bullish on the chances for a new NAFTA or USMCA political or prospects on Capitol Hill is you have to have a political campaign blueprint that is built now and going into execution mode every single day relentlessly until that vote is passed. And having worked on Capitol Hill, right, we all know like trade votes on Capitol Hill are very, very hard. When you have agreements by both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue about the benefits, about the mechanics of the campaign, about the investment that they have in winning, if you have total agreement on that, they're still really, 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 really hard, right? And the White House, I don't think, has demonstrated that they can do even some of the easy stuff. And so the idea that they can get in concert with their allies on Capitol Hill, potentially a Democratic majority in the House in just a few months, I say, color me skeptical. What does the business community do? I would actually say, let me go beyond the word business community. What does the pro-trade community have to do? First, they have to buy into the concept that economic principles like trade do not promote themselves. They do not defend themselves. So every single day, the pro-trade community has to, they can never take a day off. And that was why every time I build one of these campaigns, the two attributes that I try to make sure are in part of the campaign messaging and part of the campaign execution are volume and intensity. Because I learned from the TPA fight, when we came in and started to get engaged in it in late 2014, you're talking thousands of phone calls every single day from the anti-trade forces going into Capitol Hill offices and putting them at bay on a yes vote. So we had to counter that and then beat that in the space of 6 to 8 months. That's very hard to do, but it was key to success, matching that volume and intensity on the anti-trade side. And then the messages I think we all agree on. It's a lot of what we were just talking about earlier, which is going out and personalizing and localizing the debate. I think the ag community is a case study in doing this very effectively. They don't talk about trade as an economic theory. They talk about it as life or death sometimes, or I should say it's a lifeblood of the local economy, whether it's jobs, wages, employment, overall economic health. And they do so through the lens of the soybean trade in Iowa, or the livestock trade out in the plain states. So that's one of the ways where I think you can be most effective and have that outside-in strategy of building towards that number of votes that you're going to need to win up on Capitol Hill.
And I think, I think we've got to, just as ag has been able to broaden the discussion away from manufactured goods, services has to do the same thing. I mean, we have surpluses with Canada and Mexico in services also. And the two largest categories overall of our surplus is intellectual property and financial and professional services. These are where the high-paying jobs are. These are where the growing jobs are. So we've got to get the discussion away from autos. I know autos are important, but there's a lot else going on in the U.S. economy and in the Canadian and Mexican economies.
This is what I call micro-political messaging, right? People ask, how can we talk to members of Congress? How can we reach them? And I say, well, you have to go knock on their doors. You have to meet with their staffs. You have to follow up with their staffs. You have to continue that discussion. You have to build coalitions that are different than what you would think. Because I think NAFTA, or the new NAFTA, is going to be an opportunity to do just that going forward. The number of jobs affected, the number of the opportunities going forward is going to be different than when we were talking about NAFTA 20 years ago. So if they don't know your story, if members of Congress don't know your stories, how can they be your champion on Capitol Hill? And that's why it's important to go out there and continue that discussion, but to build a campaign like Kevin talked about that is clear and succinct. Why is it important to you and to your industries?
So has the lobbying changed in a way that with this particular administration that is very focused on goods trade and the deficit that it has with other countries in goods trade, about the importance of services trade and the whole picture of a trade agreement and updating and modernizing NAFTA, which obviously does a lot for services? Has the lobbying changed in that way that you kind of need to do an education effort and maybe educate not just the pro-trade community, but also lawmakers that then have to sell the message at home, basically?
I think that's right. One of the ways I look at it is in an administration that oftentimes doesn't have a high level of expertise on some of this, or is not really doesn't have a high level of knowledge about the services industry and its trade impact there, is the lobbying strategy has to be about first becoming a resource for those folks because they outsource perspective and insight, probably more so than other administrations. And when they're looking for outsourcing insight, it's better that it's you than one of your opponents, or a competing industry, I should say. So making sure you position yourself as that resource. The other thing is, I think the lobbying world has always been very, and I say this nicely, there's a lot of lobbyists in the room, they're very focused on making the case for access. Access is very important. But insight and the larger universe where they go and gather insight, whether it's from third-party organizations or organizations back home that really drive the headlines on a lot of this, making sure that you're engaged with those audiences as much as possible to create that wider universe is important. The last thing I would say, and this is something that I'd ask the services industry to consider how they would do it with their unique set of circumstances on trade, is Americanizing the debate. Now, I think we all believe that trade, many of those of us who are true free traders believe that trade, everybody wins or should win or can win, right? It's about give and take, right? But you have to make the case for American economic preeminence and how your particular industry is an important part of a thriving American economy and how this is going to be a competition in the global marketplace and that some of these approaches will help America stay forward on this. If you look at the telecommunications industry, what they're doing right now with 5G and how they're Americanizing the debate over 5G, us versus us leading the way and therefore having a stronger growing economy, that's another good case study on how you Americanize some of these issues.
That's right. You have to, like I said before, you have to play your advantage. And your advantage here is that you are interconnected with, for example, with manufacturing. You have a trade surplus in the United States. So clearly, if members of Congress are going to be your champions, if they're going to support your causes, they have to know what you do. But you also have to focus on them. If you're going to go see, member X from District Y, you have to go in and explain to them, this is why this is important to you because X number of jobs count. Are in your district, for example. Just simple as that. Talking about the macro impacts of trade, while important and critical, and explains why, as a nation, it's part of our national security, and we have to, and economic security. But explaining it to a member of Congress who has to take that vote and explain to his or her constituents back home, I did this because of you, is absolutely important right now. And that is what is lacking, I believe, in trade.
Let's talk about China for a moment. Patricia, in your report, you said that the services exports are growing much faster in developing countries. You list China as one of them. Can you talk about the perils of ignoring services trade with China when it comes to the broader China discussion that's mainly focused on goods trade right now?
Sure. The part I'm actually really surprised about is China's ignoring this for now. All of the discussion back and forth between the U.S. and China has dealt with goods trade, and specifically, what are you going to slap tariffs on? I mean, we currently have close to a $40 billion surplus in services trade. I mean, granted, it's small compared to our overall deficit of $360 billion, but it would be $40 billion higher without our surplus in trade. China runs out quickly on things they can slap tariffs on because we import so much more from them than they import from us. At some point, their attention is going to turn to the services that they import from the U.S. And given that the content, the domestic content of services is so much higher than the domestic content of goods exports. So for example, when the U.S. exports a service directly, close to 95% of that value was generated in the U.S. When the U.S. exports a good, something closer to 85% is domestic content. You've got parts and other types of intellectual property, flowing back and forth. So if what the U.S. cares about is creating a strong job situation for itself, it can't afford to ignore the situation with trade, because I'm actually really surprised the Chinese have ignored that part for so long.
Well, I don't know if they really have, or if we just don't know about it yet.
Yeah. Maybe there's this great plan, but it's not something that that I've been able to read anything at all about. I mean, the U.S. ignores the trade component. You would think that the only thing we export are goods, but a third of our exports are services.
And do you maybe all of you think that on messaging trade with China, is this a black and white issue? Are there nuances? Because clearly this administration is very focused on China, but also, the Democratic Party historically has been very focused on going hard against China. So, where are we now? Is there maybe a new trade with China and the message that's being discussed right now?
Look, it's an interesting place to be for a Democrat in the House right now and in the Senate. For many years, we have been talking as Democrats about IP theft and forced technology, theft by China, and now that the Trump administration has taken some steps, in general, we do support that, but we don't quite understand what else is going on in terms of the trade war that he's continuing with China. So I think Democrats are kind of in an interesting position at this moment. Should they fully support the president on this trade, war with China, or should they raise some concerns? And I believe they have raised some concerns. What's going to happen going forward is going to depend on the election. You're going to have a lot of newly elected members of Congress. Some of them are going to be free traders. Some of them are actually going to be supportive of a trade war with and the Trump administration's positions on these issues. So it's just going to depend on the makeup of the Congress. You're going to have between 60 and 90 new members of Congress on both sides of the aisle coming in. And it's going to be and that's why it's important, actually. Let me finish with this. And that's why it's important for you to go out and explain to them why it's critical to support what you believe in, why it's critical to support your trade agenda.
It's the China question, I would call it the China contrast issue, I think is an interesting one. What I find political, if you look at just political audiences and how they respond to it, you can take the most conservative Republican and the most liberal Democrat, and kind of the tough on China message, really, they respond. But I think it's a short-term gain that you make, because I think the larger risk that you still run is China is such an important part of the global economy. And picking these types of fights with China, particularly when we have so many more multinational companies and with strong footprints here in the United States, you still run the risk of hurting growth, global growth. And when you pick that fight, you do so at your own peril on the growth issue. And ultimately, the economic growth issue is the longer term one, more fundamental to how people react and drive their support for or against a particular legislative remedy. So you run the risk of economic slowdown when you pick the wrong fight on trade on the China issue. And so I think there's ways that you have to just thread it perfectly, which is talk about economic competitors around the globe, but at the same time make sure that you're not alienating a huge part of the global economy.
And you've already seen the downgrade in growth both by the IMF and the OECD.
Because of the trade war, right?
The trade war.
Right at election time, right? It's
Yeah.
and economic views on the economy tend to take they don't turn on a dime. They take 4 to 6 months usually. And the president declared his trade war, that trade wars are good and easy and we can win them, on March 2nd of this year. And when the first counter tariff activity took place, it was around June. So it's right at election day. And I think that will be an interesting thing to gauge coming out of this particular election in November.
It was interesting, particularly with regards to China, that the newest round of tariffs on China only go into place halfway last month. They're waiting till after Christmas buying season because they're going to really impact consumer goods.
Right.
So for the Christmas shoppers not to be really stressed out about this.
Yeah.
Do you see this as a short-term messaging for the bulk of, I guess, lawmakers who are now in a pickle of, do we go with the president? Because that was always, I mean, the Democrats who were always, on that side of going against China, and the Republicans that might be biting their tongue. Is this sort of something that we see, that you expect will change after Election Day when, maybe, the tariffs go up to 25% next year, or maybe there will be more tariffs, so there will be more with China? Will there be sort of a wake-up reshuffling of what's happening now versus after the election?
Well, I got out of the prediction business in 2016, so like a lot of people in this room. But
I can still forecast recession.
I will say that right from here to November, I can tell you what's going to happen. And this is a base election in their minds. They're all in with the president. They don't want a lot of these Republicans don't want any space between them and the president, because that's how they're going to animate people to the polls and then they'll let the chips fall on November 6th.
Look, if you look up polling, the attitudes of Democrats supporting just generally free trade agreements and trade in general has gone up, while Republican attitudes have gone down. So this is the dilemma we're facing. Things have changed since 2016 for sure. What's going to happen after the election? I predict that there's going to be more Democrats speaking out and saying that this is hurting our national interest, that this is hurting our economy.
Interesting. I know you don't want to predict so much, but why not? If you had to sell the new NAFTA now, if there was a vote, that you have to set up for now, and Mitch McConnell yesterday ruled out a vote in the lame duck, which is the first time we heard, later on the record saying that. So let's say it's happening now. How do members need to sell this now? If you had to advise them now, how do you get this over the finish line? It's an upgrade, or it's it does this and this to your district or state. What do you say to them?
I'll defer to my Democratic colleague across the aisle on how you get Democrats to vote.
Well, not just Democrats.
Well, I think with Republicans, it's look, and you're right. Republican support for trade it's gone up and down, peaks and valleys. Most of those peaks are when they respond very quickly to signals from the president. The Republican base will say, well, if Trump says it's good, well, then we support it. And that is the way that I think they would market this, which is that the president has gone and taken a bad deal and made it better. He's essentially changed the font and the font size on it, and a couple of rules of origin rules, and changed the name of it, and now it's Trump's NAFTA. It's his version of it. So therefore, you will see stronger support for it, and that's how they'll sell it, I think, in Republican districts.
Well, the devil's in the details, and I would not recommend any Democrat really do anything until after the elections. Lame duck, I think McConnell said, made the right decision because the votes are not there, I think, whether in the House or the Senate on the Democratic side. How do you sell this? You have to wait and see, and you have to, it's a tough sell. It is absolutely a tough sell, no question about it.
I'm not a messaging person, but it seems to me, Jenny referred to it as NAFTA. Some people referring to it NAFTA light. I think the White House has already kind of lost that messaging part because people go, well, what's the difference? They go, oh, it's basically the same. It's just tinkering around the edges. There's nobody out there that can possibly say, oh, this is a totally amazingly different New Deal. Plus the acronym they came up with, it's terrible.
Yeah, I would also argue that the time is their biggest enemy. The longer you go on this, the bigger problem they're going to have making the case for it. And that was the same thing with TPP. There was a crucial window, it was missed, and it was gone. And you start to get it, and like it's the easy thing for the easier part of being anti-trade or anti-FTA is all you need is one line. And if you find one thing to exploit, it's a lot easier to keep people from voting no. It's always easier for people to go home and explain a no vote than it is to explain a yes vote. So that's one of the big things is time is not on their side.
What can you couple it with, though? I mean, because it's not going to happen in the lame duck, right? And if you have a piece of legislation that may be a bit controversial, that may not be very popular within within a caucus or a conference, what can you couple it with in order to pass? What can you get with it in order to pass? Could it be a jobs bill here in the United States? Could it be, an infrastructure package? Could it be something else? In order to, to have the same vehicles, both vehicles pass at the same time. In order, that way you guarantee passage of both things, and you're getting a victory on something that's a priority for you, but at the same time also getting something done.
So it sounds like you were touching on something that maybe your old boss might be asking for if she's a speaker in 2019. Maybe you can walk us through, how does a vote on the new NAFTA?
Sounds like a fleshed out plan to me.
I have not. No. Let me be very clear. I have not spoken to anyone in my former office.
But knowing
about that.
How it went in the past with your former boss and trade agreements, how do you see this play itself out here?
Look, in the past, she has supported trade agreements and has opposed trade agreements. I know when President Bush was in office, one of the first things we did as Speaker, she brought down one of the trade agreements free trade agreements that he wanted passed. So it just depends on what the agenda is for the Democrats. It depends on, what is the deal of the possible, what can get done, and whether the groups, whether are outside, or whether members begin to feel, well, there's some worker protection, there's some labor protection, there's some environmental protections. I mean, I think those are the pillars of that Democrats try to view with any trade agreement. And is there enough, again, to couple it with something else? And this is just speaking from experience. I think both Kevin and I have seen it on both sides. When you want something done and it's tough, well, what can you do? What can you give for it in order to get it done?
So deal-making mode is what I'm going to be looking for when this is going to. What are the biggest or the common misconceptions that you have encountered on trade, and sort of what's your advice on how to combat those misconceptions?
What's one of the biggest misperceptions about trade? Well, I think, let me tell a story from the 2016 conventions where the personalization and localization opportunities were missed. Like, I remember, if you think back to 2016, it was Philadelphia and Cleveland were where the conventions were. And, like, the anti-trade forces were out en masse. And every day as I drove from the hotel or rode from the hotel to the convention sites for both, I was at both, because I was doing some cable news commentary, and I would just pass these ports full of trade activity. And here you have everybody, like a huge chunk of this great American city, whether it's Philadelphia or Cleveland, dependent on trade. And all the anti-trade voices are out en masse, and there were no real folks out there making the case the same way for trade. And that, for me, again, is always a sign of a huge missed opportunity. So telling that story through the local lens, I was shocked that, it's Seattle, but Seattle City Council voted like 15-0 against Trade Promotion Authority. It's like, Seattle. Have you taken a look at Seattle? It's nothing but, it's trade activity everywhere. So making sure that you fight those fights, or have those big debates, engage in those big debates with passion, with prejudice in favor of trade, is an important part of winning the debate long term.
I think the biggest misperception, though, that it's a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
That if China's winning, the U.S. must be losing. Mm-hmm. There's no appreciation on how lower prices benefit consumers. I mean, the problem with trade is that the pain is very localized. If that factory in that town closes down, then the dry cleaner, the bakery, everybody else, the whole community suffers. But the benefits are so diffuse. So, as an economy, we've done a bad job trying to figure out how to help compensate the losers so that the gains are more palatable.
I agree. That's exactly right. You know, again, I keep going back to something I know, which is how do you get votes and how do you message perhaps a controversial or a difficult bill through Congress? Just like Kevin said, you have to localize it. You have to personalize it to those members of Congress. You have a story to tell. You know why your industries are important. You have to go and you have to tell it.
We're like almost out of time. I was going to ask you if you think that the trade and services agreement is ever going to come out of the freezer, but I'll leave that for other panels. Just one anecdote, if Steve Simchak is here, I saw him on the street on Friday, and before that I saw Dennis Shea, the WTO ambassador, and he said that they're still under review for TISA and EGA, and that made his weekend. So with that, I think Steve Simchak was really happy. Yeah, thank you all for being here and listening, and thanks to you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good job.
Many thanks to our panelists. It's now my pleasure to release you all for lunch. Please head out the door and to your left. Some tables are assigned, so please check your badges to see if you have an assigned seat. Otherwise, feel free to sit anywhere, and I will meet you there.